What have been the coolest kind of things that you've learned about the human brain? That were there anything that like was there anything that was surprising in any sense, or just like the way that, so much of what we experience in our own various contexts just affects how the human brain develops and learns to survive and have all these different coping mechanisms and all that?
Yeah. Oh gosh, great question. Actually, have you heard of flipping the lid?
No, what's that?
No. So basically, there's something called the hand model of the brain, and it's been developed by Dan Siegel, who is a psychologist and quite prominent in the field, who does a lot of like neuroscience-y stuff crossed with psychology. And flipping the lid is a concept talking about when we get very emotionally dysregulated and what happens in the brain. But it's like a very fun, simple way of explaining it, as opposed to like this neurotransmitter and this. So basically, if we think about the brain being like this, the most important parts of the brain are kind of more towards the center of the brain. So in case we go through head injury, we still have our basic functions like breathing and digestion, and like our heart keeps beating, that kind of thing. So our brainstem sends a lot of those signals. And then we've got this it's in the inner kind of base back part of our brain. It's a part called the amygdala, and that's like the caveman brain, or like the emotion brain. And you're nodding because the amygdala comes up a lot in psychology. This is the part that's there to protect you, basically.
Yeah.
It's also the one where you get all the feelings. So if people are in their feels, their amygdala is probably activating. And then you've got this top part of the brain, which develops a bit later in life, and that's the prefrontal cortex. And so that's the bit up here. And so usually we would say that upstairs and downstairs brain are working together. We have certain feelings, we think through our actions, and then we act in accordance with them. And so everyone's like one good team. But the flipping the lid happens when our amygdala activates really, really high. And so let's say there's a really strong emotion of you've just seen your ex-boyfriend. Massive panic. Amygdala activates, and then we flip our lid, and then essentially our prefrontal cortex, or like the smart part of our brain, just kind of like flips off. And so that's like the logical thinking, problem solving, planning, ethical decision making, the part that holds us back from making stupid decisions. And that brain, basically the activation basically reduces, and our amygdala goes way up. And then the amygdala does stuff like the fight response, flight response, or the freeze response. And so you might act out by yelling at your ex, trying to duck around a corner and avoid them, or maybe just kind of freeze and kind of freak out. And so the hand model of the brain talks about how, well, actually, when we're really, really emotional and we're like a 10 out of 10, this is not a good time to be making life decisions, because this smart part of our brain has turned off. And so when I explain it to parents of young kids, a lot of them kind of say, my kid's highly oppositional, disrespectful, they're crying, they're yelling at me, and then I tell them to do something, or I tell them to think about something, or is that the right thing to do? And they just scream at me some more. How can I fix the kid? Whereas we actually think, well, you know what? When they're flipped, they don't have the capacity to do any of that thinking, problem solving. The idea is that we actually need to soothe the emotional part of the brain, make it feel safe, let the prefrontal cortex come back in, and then we can do the teaching about rules and boundaries. And so to summarize, I love the hand model of the brain because it gave me such a sense of empathy for people who get really emotional, or even with children who have really big behavioral outbursts. Like, you really don't have control over whether your brain flips or not. You can learn strategies, which we do in therapy, on how to make it kind of come back quicker. But when we're highly dysregulated, really emotional, we don't have the capacity to think logically. It's an evolutionary thing that's built in to protect us. And so when I see kids crying on the floor nowadays, when I go to the supermarket and they're flipping out and they're like chucking a tantrum on the floor, instead of thinking, gosh, what a naughty kid, I think, oh gosh, that child is really overwhelmed. Like, their brain has kind of shut off. They're in survival mode. And so that gives parents, I think, this sense of, oh, my child isn't bad. They're just overwhelmed and they need help. And so going through this like flipping the lid concept is often a bit of a turning point in therapy, where parents kind of go, oh, understanding the brain actually helps me understand my child better, and it helps me help them better.